Following the defeat of Nazi Germany on the 8th of May 1945, the world awoke to the grim realities of the Holocaust and the atrocities committed within the barbed wires of Auschwitz. But the story did not end with the liberation of the survivors. A new chapter of retribution began. The Allied forces immediately set about locating and arresting those involved in the final solution, including lengthy investigations, sometimes lasting years, to discover who had fled or gone into hiding, and to determine those who had been active participants in the extermination. Among those brought to justice were the very architects of torment, the cruel SS guards of Auschwitz. The ones most responsible, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler, committed suicide before they could ever receive justice for their crimes. Around 500 Auschwitz guards were executed, almost all by hanging, often in the presence of hundreds of spectators. Here are their stories. The guards at Auschwitz, members of the SS Totenkampfverbände, the Death's Head units, were some of the war's most nefarious criminals. Not only did they oversee the running and administration of the concentration camps, organizing the execution of millions, but they also often took a sadistic pleasure in personally torturing, beating, and even raping inmates who lived entirely at their whim. Kurt Hugo Müller, referred to by the inmates of Auschwitz as the man with the dog, was a thoroughly convinced Nazi long before the war, having joined the party in 1932. He was sent to work at Auschwitz in 1940, where he escorted and guarded work parties. He was soon promoted to Blockführer, in charge of administering a barracks room. He was at one point the head of Block 11, also known as the Death Block. Müller was known for his sadistic cruelty, with his favorite instrument of punishment being his dog, which he would use to intimidate and maul prisoners. He was charged after the war and was executed on the 24th of January 1948, the last of 21 to be hung that day. Paul Gotze was a professional painter before the war. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and eventually volunteered for the SS in 1942 and was sent to Auschwitz in July of that year. He served as a Blockführer like Müller and served the same role in the Romani camp at Birkenau. He directly participated in the killing of prisoners and helped exterminate the population of the Birkenau Romani camp in 1944. For all his vicious crimes, he was considered by the prisoners he reigned over to be the reasonable guard. After being tried at the Auschwitz trials, he was executed on the same day as Müller. Herbert Paul Ludwig joined the party in 1932, 1 year before Hitler was appointed as Chancellor of Germany, and the eventual Reichstag fire would cement Hitler's absolute power. He was assigned to work at Auschwitz in 1940, where he guarded prisoners working on agricultural duties. He eventually became a Blockführer and at some point was promoted to Rapportführer, commanding a group of multiple Blockführer. The Rapportführer held considerable influence within the camp and were known for their extreme brutality. Ludwig was responsible for transporting prisoners to the gas chambers, many of whom were young or sick, and he would abuse them as they made their way to their deaths. He was also known for whipping those prisoners under his command or beating them with a whip. Wilhelm Gerhard Göring was an early member of the SS, joining in 1934 when the group was still in its infancy. He worked at various camps between 1934 and the end of 1941, arriving at Auschwitz in 1942. He worked as both a Blockführer and Kommandoführer, supervising the Camp Sonderkommando work gangs. He eventually worked as the commandant of the Auschwitz subcamp, Eintrachthutte, until its evacuation in January 1945. He was in charge of the notorious Block 11, a special building housing various punishment rooms, and also where the first executions by Zyklon B were carried out. He was executed alongside the others on the 24th of January, being the 9th person to be executed that day. Hans Ahlmeyer joined the SA in 1931 working as a driver. After being transferred to the SS later that year, he quickly rose through the ranks, becoming Schutzhaftlagerführer of Auschwitz, overseeing and organizing the efficient and functional running of the camp. He soon became notorious for his extreme violence, such as on the 19th of March 1942, when he personally ordered and observed the execution of 144 female prisoners, all shot against the black wall of Block 11. He was accused of corruption and theft and was removed from his position at Auschwitz and sent to command a group of Jewish forced laborers constructing fortifications. At the time of his capture, he was at the Terningmoen concentration camp in Norway. During his trial, which lasted 21 days, he claimed to have never participated in any killing whatsoever, and neither had the men under his command. Judged guilty, he declared he would die as a Zudenbach for Germany, a scapegoat, and was executed on the 24th of January 1948, the second to die that day. Rudolf Höss was commandant of Auschwitz between 1940 and 1943. Serving longer than any other commandant, he turned to extreme nationalism immediately after World War I, joining the Freikorps and participating in attacks on French occupation forces. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and the SS in 1934, being sent to work in the Dachau concentration camp. He was the first commandant of Auschwitz and oversaw its expansion from a relatively small camp to the sprawling complex it eventually became. He was the first to use Zyklon B for mass executions, and during his trial, he said of the time he first observed its use, "This gassing set my mind at rest, for the mass extermination of the Jews was to start soon." After being recalled from Auschwitz, he returned in 1944 to organize the efficient execution of 430,000 Hungarian Jews, who were executed over 56 days. After the fall of the Third Reich and the death of Adolf Hitler, Höss disguised himself as a member of the German Navy. He adopted the name Franz Lang and lived quietly as a gardener with his family. He lived in peace for almost a year until his location was tracked down by Hans Alexander, a German Jew who had fled to Britain in 1936. Alexander and a group of British soldiers were sent to his home. His wife gave up his location, and though denying he was anyone other than Franz Lang, he was finally identified by the inscription inside his wedding ring. He was extradited to Poland, where he underwent trial for crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death on the 27th of March, 1947, condemned to be hung. He was executed at the former Gestapo headquarters at Auschwitz. Hanged on the 16th of April, his execution was watched by around 100 spectators, including former prisoners and Polish officials, and was the last public execution in Poland. Female SS guards. Something that shocked the entire world was the participation of many women in the brutal crimes of Nazi Germany. After the war, many were sentenced to death and imprisonment alongside their male counterparts. 3,600 German women worked directly inside the concentration camps. 60 of these were tried for their crimes, with 21 receiving a sentence of death. Many of these women, members of the SS Women's Division, the SS Gefolge, were just as cruel and sadistic as their male equivalents in the SS Totenkopfverbände. Maria Mandl was an Austrian living in Monskirchen, but quickly moved to Munich following the German annexation of Austria in 1938. She began working at Lichtenberg camp that same year. She was sent to work in Auschwitz in 1942, where she held the rank of SS Lagerführerin, giving her total control over all female inmates and camp workers. She was known to the prisoners as the Beast due to her vicious nature. Witness statements from her trial tell of her purposefully separating mothers from their children. In perhaps her cruelest action, she forced hundreds of women into one cell block, totally naked, and left them there for 7 days without food or water. After 7 days, most had died, and in their hunger, the captives had fed on some of the bodies. She fled back to her home in Austria following the Allied victory, taking refuge with her sister, after her father refused to accommodate her, but was arrested by the U.S. Army 3 months later. She was executed on the 24th of January, and according to Stanislava Raczwalova, who had been imprisoned by the Soviets for anti-Soviet activity, and who had been an inmate under Mandel. One of her last acts on Earth was to ask for their forgiveness. Mandel was perhaps one of the worst of all the female SS members and was personally complicit in the deaths of 500,000 prisoners. Irma Greza is perhaps one of the most recognizable female Nazis. She was known by the inmates of Auschwitz as the hyena of Auschwitz, while the post-war press referred to her as the beautiful beast. Her father had been a church-going Christian with little praise for the Nazi Party and forbade all his children from joining any Nazi organization. Greza and her sister Helen both joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel. She worked as a camp assistant nurse under the cruel Dr. Gebhardt, whom she worked alongside in his cruel experiments on Jewish prisoners. Going above and beyond her duties as a nurse, she roamed the camps looking for victims of abuse and murder, which she was allowed to do with impunity. She eventually had command over 30,000 female prisoners, all of whom feared her immensely. In contrast to her beastly nature, she spent hours in front of the mirror, selecting outfits from her selection of fine-tailored dresses, many of which were taken from newcomers to the camp, and applying expensive perfumes. Her trial lasted 9 weeks and resulted in a death sentence. She was executed by British professional hangman Albert Pierrepoint, who was responsible for the execution of over 200 Axis war criminals. Elizabeth Volkenrath was executed half an hour before Greza at 9:34 on the 13th of December 1945, after the Belsen trial, conducted by the British Army. Before the war, she had been a hairdresser, until she volunteered to work at a concentration camp. She was known to be incredibly sadistic, often beating women until they were unconscious. She personally participated in the selection of victims for the gas chambers. She was accused of many crimes during the trial, which she all personally denied. In one instance, she caught a starving prisoner stealing vegetables. As punishment, she was forced to kneel on the floor and hold the vegetables above her head. After 4 hours, she could no longer hold her arms up, and Volkenrath beat her with a rubber club. Missed justice. In the decades following the war, many more criminals were discovered and captured. Some had remained in Europe, while others had traveled to South America, and all had adopted new identities. Between 1945 and 2005, 140,000 accused Nazi war criminals were brought to trial, with 6,656 resulting in convictions. One of the most recent convictions was that of Josef Schutz. At the age of 101, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the Holocaust. In an odd twist, the 101-year-old Nazi war criminal was tried in a juvenile court due to his age at the time of the offenses. If any Nazi war criminals do remain, they will be in their 90s and, even if tried and sentenced, will be unlikely to ever truly receive justice.